welcome everybody to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I am Gary Michuta, and we are doing yet another feature here on the channel. Many of you know we're famous for our Deep Dives multi-part series where we go in detail. We show you all the evidence. We present the evidence, the arguments, and leave it to you to decide. And sometimes the long format is a little bit too much, especially if you're not a nerd and you just want the facts. Well, that's why I decided to do these Canon 101 series, because we're going to do short, less than half hour, compressed, condensed, high points, and how to answer objections and other things as well about the Deuterocanon. So you don't have to sit through a lengthy video. All the facts are there, and I present my case and how to answer some of these very common objections. And today, indeed, is a very common objection. It is that the Jews supposedly never accepted the Deuterocanon. So is that true? The Jews never accepted the Deuterocanon? What does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to investigate in this short Canon 101 episode. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse 101 begins now. So let's look at the evidence, shall we? The Jews never accepted the Deuterocanon. Well, the first thing, whenever somebody states the Jews this or the Jews that, you need to disambiguate the word Jews. Why? Because you have to find out who specifically are you talking about and at what period of time, because Judaism was never monolithic. It's not even monolithic today. And so you need to define what you mean when you say the Jews never accepted Deuterocanon. Which Jews and when? Because in the first century, Judaism was not monolithic. It was polyformic. It was comprised of various groups, sects, and schools. And all of them, by the way, claimed to be the true expression of Judaism. And yet, interesting enough, several of them differed on what constituted the sacred books. In other words, some groups affirmed some books and others denied those same books. So it wasn't a single view on the Deuterocanon in the first century. And all you have to do is just look at the evidence. I'm not going to go deep in this, but just as an overview, we have the Sadducees and also the Samaritans, although they're not Jews technically. The Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of Scripture known as the Torah or the Pentateuch. They rejected all of the prophets and all of the writings. There is also another group of Jews that were in Qumran. This is the famous Dead Sea Scroll community that we hear so much about. And scholars believe that they accepted the proto-canonical books minus the book of Esther. There is not a single copy fragment of Esther in Qumran. And they seem to have accepted Sirach, Deuterocanonical book, Tobit, another Deuterocanonical book, First Enoch, which is pseudepigraphical, and perhaps even others. So their canon was very different, of course, from the Sadducees' Samaritan canon, though we shouldn't really use the word canon at this early date. Let's just say collections of sacred books. Now, the Pharisees were famously split into 2 schools, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And as far as we can tell from rabbinic sources, the school of Shammai denied the sacredness of Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Esther. Well, the school of Hillel, although they also are Pharisees, not only affirmed the sacredness of those 3 books, but they may have actually included others, and that's according to the Lutheran theologian Sundberg. He postulates that if any of these sects that are responsible for the preservation of the Deuterocanon, it most likely would be the Pharisees, which would be the school of Hillel. So that's speculative, but it's interesting. But nevertheless, the point is the Pharisees were split at least on 3 books for sure, perhaps others. Then you have the Jews outside of Judea, known as the diaspora. The diaspora Jews were Greek-speaking Jews, and they used a early pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint or the 70. And the Septuagint, as you know, we have absolutely no evidence of any Septuagint being restricted to only the proto-canonical books. They famously included deuterocanonical books as well. And then there are other groups that we're aware of their existence, but we don't have any information about whether they had differing views on what sacred books were. Obviously, they would differ from one of the parties mentioned above. But the Herodians, we know about the Herodians, we know about the Zealots, we know about the Jews in Thermopylae, and we also know about non-aligned Jews. Of course, the Septuagint that was used by the diaspora itself is evidence of a Jewish reception of the Deuterocanon. After all, these books were copied by Jews and placed amongst the other texts of the Old Testament. Often it appears that there was no distinction, qualification. They were intermixed with the other books, which signals that these Jews understood them to be essentially the same in terms of sacredness. You also have the fact that the New Testament preferred quoting the Old Testament with the Septuagint. So there seems to be a Christian exception of the Septuagint and possibly the Deuterocanon. And then the New Testament itself, and we've gone over, there's many chill streams, you could check it out on the channel, of where the New Testament uses, references, and alludes to the Deuterocanon in ways that bespeak of it as being sacred scripture. And then on top of that, you also have the Dead Sea Scroll community. Like we said, they accepted at least Sirach and Tobit, perhaps also the Epistle of Jeremiah, which is chapter 6 of the Deuterocanonical book of Baruch. So there's plenty evidence of a pre-Christian and Christian era accepting of these books, reception of these books. But there's more. There's also hard data. For example, Emmanuel Taube, in his book Scribal Practices and Approaches Reflected in the Text of the Judean Desert, page 167 here, he makes an interesting observation. He says, in the Judean desert text, a special arrangement of poetic units is known almost exclusively for biblical text, including Ben Sira. And then he gives two texts, 2Q Sir from Qumran and Masir, which comes from Masada. So these are two different Jewish communities that copied Ben Sira using this special poetic layout that, as Toe points out, is apparently exclusively biblical. And then he goes on, he points out some other text as well, non-biblical text that are poetic, but apparently not in this particular format. He notes that a rewritten Bible composition is written in a special layout, may imply that its scribe considered this composition a biblical text, which is kind of interesting. Says so far the only known exception is the non-biblical 4Q Messianic Apocalypse 4Q 52122, written in the most simple stitchographic layout, and it's system 1B below. So there's only one other text, the 4Q Messianic Apocalyptic text, that has a very simple layout and may also suggest possible exception or reception, I should say, by the scribe. He continues and says that Ben Sira was included in this group probably implies that this book was considered to be biblical, not necessarily by the Qumran community, but by the scribes of 2Q Sirach and Masir. Of the medieval Ben Sira scrolls, manuscript B was written stitchographically, along with manuscripts A, C, D, E, and F were not. Okay. So what is he saying? It seems like there is a special layout that was used only for biblical poetic text, and there are at least two very early examples of Ben Sira being copied using this special technique, which signals that they accepted these books or received these books as sacred scripture. So we actually have textual evidence of a Jewish reception. Now, I think Tove is very clear on this, but actually, let me go back. there is something we need to note. There's more to this evidence because it's not the same scribe that wrote 2Q Sir or the Misada text. These are two separate scribes who copied it for two separate communities at two separate times. Both of them are either 50 AD to 50 BC, sometime within that period. So he says, you can't infer from the scribe that the whole community believed the same thing the scribe did. But on the other hand, it does show that some Jews did accept it as biblical, okay, which contradicts the objection. The Jews never accepted the Deuterocanon. Some did. So in addition to everything we've seen, we also have manuscript evidence of a Jewish reception of at least Ben Sira. We also have evidence in terms of manuscripts from the Proto-Theodotion text, Proto-Theodotion translation. So this was made early, 1st century AD, or very, very late, like within a couple of decades of the turn of the era. Proto-Theodotion was a translation from Hebrew into Greek, and lo and behold, we find out that Proto-Theodotion translated Baruch and Deuterodaniel. So these are deuterocanonical books, and this is a Jewish translation. Therefore, some Jews did indeed accept these books very, very early on. But what about Judaism after Christianity takes off the ground? Oh, this is a slide. I already went over that. What about Rabbinic Judaism in the 2nd Christian century? Even then, there still is evidence of reception, especially the book of Ben Sira or Sirach. Now, I'm going to quote from Lee Martin MacDonald, a Baptist scholar, in his book, The Biblical Canon. He writes, quote, "The popularity of Sirach among the rabbis is illustrated by several references where various passages in Sirach are cited with approval. For example," and then it gives several rabbinic passages where Sirach is cited. And then it continues and says, "Sirach was introduced with scriptural introductions, as it is written, to support positions or argument or argue points." Let's just pause right there. It's introduced with formal introductions, like it is written, and he actually calls it scriptural introductions. And Ben Sira is quoted to support positions or argue points. In other words, it's being used in a canonical fashion. All of these point to a reception of Sirach as canonical scripture. Continuing on, MacDonald says, Sirach, however, has a mixed tradition in the Talmudic literature. On the one hand, it was eventually rejected as a part of the Jewish canon, especially by Rabbi Akiba in the late 1st century CE, but it is sometimes cited as part of scripture in other texts, especially in Berita Baba Kama 92b. After the writing of the two Talmuds, it appears that the common use of Sirach ceased from widespread use in Rabbinic Judaism, but it continued in Christian community. In other words, we find even in post-Christian early Judaism that at least Ben Sira was continued to be used in a scriptural fashion. So obviously, there was even Rabbinic Jews that accepted the sacredness of Ben Sira. They use it in a canonical way with formal introduction. They use it to establish certain points, and ultimately, it eventually ends. But it continues with the Christian community, interesting enough. Now, remember, this is not a Catholic author, but he says the Christians continue to use it. There's other evidence as well, such as the 22 or 24 book computation. There's evidence to show that this Jewish computation did include at times deuterocanonical books. For example, if you watch our chill stream on Melito Sardis, you'll get all the details for this. But the 22 books he lists includes and the Wisdom, which seems to refer to a separate book, either the Wisdom of Solomon or Sirach. So within the 22-book Jewish computation, we have either wisdom or Sirach being included. In Cyril of Jerusalem, his 22-book computation explicitly includes Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah. And Athanasius also explicitly places among the canonical books the Deuterocanonical book of Baruch and the Epistle. And we also find a 24-book computation in Hilary of Poitiers. He gives the 22 and then he gives a 24. And he says, quote, "And this is the cause of the law of the Old Testament is divided into 22 books, that it may agree with the number of letters. These books are arranged according to the tradition of the ancients, so that 5 are of Moses," and then he continues and lists the proto-canonical books. And he says this completes the number of 22 books. And some it has seemed good to add Tobias and Judith to Deuterocanonical books, and thus constitute 24 books according to the Greek alphabet. So 22 and 24 books are typical rabbinic combinations of books. And yet, look at here, even within the 22 and the 24 book computations, we have evidence of Deuterocanonical books being used. This, I think, also points to a Jewish reception. Now, I'm not saying it's universal by any means, but remember the objection. The Jews never accepted the Deuterocanon. That obviously has to be qualified quite a bit. There's also Christian evidence that Baruch continued to be read as scripture in the synagogues. For example, in Apostolic Constitutions 520, we find out that when the Jews assemble together, they read the Lamentations of Jeremiah, in which they read what is said, and then it quotes, "The Spirit before our face, Christ the Lord was taken in their destructions, and Baruch, in whom it is written, this is our God, none shall be esteemed with him. He found out every way of knowledge. He showed it to Jacob his son, and Israel his beloved. Afterwards, he was seen on earth and conversed with men." This, as you guys, if you watch this channel, you know Baruch 3:38. Sometimes it's 37, depending on the versification of your translation, is used a lot as a proof text for the incarnation. But the important thing here is that this is a Christian witness, and there's other witnesses as well, that the Jews are reading Baruch in the synagogues, apparently as a sacred text. Now, this is the text that was cited earlier by MacDonald, and this is Baba Kama 92b. And this, I think, is really striking. Now, remember the charge. The Jews never accepted the Deuterocanon. Well, this is a rabbinic document, and this is what it has to say. Said Rabbah to Rabbah Barbari, "How on the basis of scripture do we know that which people say a bad poem is usually finds its way into a grove of barren trees?" He said to him, "It is written in the Torah, repeated in the prophets, and mentioned a third time in the writings." And there, the word writings is Ketuvim, the third division of the Rabbinic Bible. Okay. It is learned in a Mishnah paragraph and repeated in a Tanaic statement as well. Now, notice what he does. He quotes from the law. It is written in the Torah. So Esau went to Ishmael, Genesis 28:9. Repeated in the prophets. And there gathered themselves to Jephthah, idle men, and they went out with him, Judges 11:3. It's interesting he considered judges part of the prophets. Then he says it's mentioned a third time in the writings, the third division of the Rabbinic Bible, the Ketuvim. Every fowl dwells near its kind, and man near his equal, Sirach 13:15. And it's also learned in the Mishnah paragraph. So you can see what's going on. The header says that it's found in the Torah, the prophets, the writings, the Mishnah paragraph, and Tanaic statement. Then he goes to cite each one in their proper order. But the important thing here, guys, is the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach, or Ben Sira, is being quoted as coming from the third division of the Rabbinic Bible. indicating that it was considered scripture. And this is not a Christian source. This is a Jewish source. So we have very firm evidence that um, indeed there was Jewish reception of these books. Also, we find in Epiphanius a very intriguing passage as well. He says, by the time of the captives' return from Babylon, the Jews had acquired the following books and prophets and the following books of the prophets. And then he continues and he lists all the proto-canonical books along with Baruch, the Deuterocanonical book. And then he continues at the end and says, and they, that is the Jews coming back from exile, have two more books of disputed canonicity, the wisdom of Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon, apart from certain other Apocrypha. That's from Epiphanius's Panarion. So what does he mean the Jews have? And apparently there are disputes over the canonicity of wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. Now, if all the Jews only accepted the proto-canonical books, like the objector says, how can there be Jews that would dispute that the rejection of the wisdom of Solomon and Sirach? In other words, there shouldn't be any disputes because they never were accepted by any Jew anywhere. So who are these Jews that are disputing the canonicity of these two books? Apparently, some Jews thought they were sacred. And this is a late father. This is 4th century father, roughly around the time of Jerome. So this suggests that at least some Jews, and we're talking post-Christian rabbinic Judaism, some Jews received these texts as canonical scriptures, while others did not. But that's a far cry from saying no Jew received these books. So, quick summary, guys. Which Jews and when did they reject the Deuterocanon? We have evidence both before and after the advent of rabbinic Judaism in the time of Christ that at least some Deuterocanonical books were accepted by some Jews. That's enough to overturn this common objection. There's also evidences for pre-Christian and Christian reception and evidence for a post-Christian rabbinic reception. Okay, although ultimately the rabbinic canon is universally accepted very late, probably around the 7th century, somewhere around there, maybe the 8th century. It's a little hard to pinpoint exactly when, but it seems to have come into its final forms in the very early Middle Ages, or very end of antiquity, the period of the early church fathers. So our conclusion, although the final form of the rabbinic Bible excluded the Deuterocanon, and that's really what Protestants are appealing to, very late rabbinic Judaism, there nevertheless is good evidence to show that at least some Jews, not all, but some, before this time, accepted the Deuterocanonical books as sacred text. Whew, all right. So we did it in about 25 minutes, which is pretty darn good here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse for doing a video. So I hope you like the short format. Hope you like the information. I, again, can only give you the high points. If you want to get into details, do search on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. You'll probably find a series of videos on the topic, and it'll also give you all the evidence. So there we go, guys. By the way, do me a favor. If you don't mind, please right now, go and hit that like button and also share it with friends. Hit the alarm. And also, if you consider being a member of the Apocrypha Apocalypse, help support this ministry. You get freebies. You have times where you get to chat with me and ask me any question you want, only for members. And also Patreon. William Albrecht and myself are both on Patreon. We appreciate your financial support. Patrons get freebies on William's channel, and you get freebies on mine as well. And please keep us in your prayers most of all, and get this information out. Use these short format videos to start the conversation. Till next time, I am Gary Michuta. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.